everyone, Novels Wonderland here. Thank you all for the love and support you've shown me and the channel.
Naruto Infinite Reincarnation, Chapter 100 to 105, Chapter 100, Hirako 1272 words Chapter 100, Hirako, save some for later. Kei was not surprised. He directly took out a red soldier pill, and fed it to the nine tails in front of him. After swallowing it, the nine tails spoke with obvious surprise. This soldier pill tastes pretty good. What did you use to make it? There's a familiar aura inside it. This old man recognizes it. It would be strange if it didn't feel familiar. Kei smiled. This was specially made by combining your flesh and blood with Hashirama-sama's cells. The nine tails body instantly stiffened. Made from this old man's flesh and blood and Senja Hashirama's. No wonder it had felt a familiar aura just now. So this thing had actually been made using its own flesh and blood. It was eating itself. Of course it would feel familiar. Although the nine tails did not possess human ethics or morality, the thought of eating itself still made it feel somewhat disgusted. The soldier pill that had seemed delicious just a moment ago suddenly lost much of its appeal. There's no need to reject it so quickly. Kei shook his head at its reaction. Leaving aside the psychological factor, this is actually very beneficial to you. To others, the nine tails' flesh and blood was highly toxic. Forget eating it, just touching a little could be fatal. But to the nine tails itself, it was simply its own power. Now, through the form of a soldier pill, it could slowly absorb that flesh and blood, turning it into new strength, and allowing this newly cultivated nine tails body to grow at an accelerated rate. And judging from the results, the effect was clearly excellent. Even if we ignore this old man's flesh and blood, is it really fine to use Senja Hashirama's cells to make soldier pills? The nine tails glanced at Kei. If this old man remembers correctly, he was your first Hokage. In the end, things like that do not really matter. Kei smiled. The dead must eventually make way for the living. If the first Hokage's cells can be used to make medicine and save many people in the future, then if Hashirama-sama knew of it, he would probably feel gratified. In Kei's eyes, as long as one was not obsessed with transplanting Hashirama cells into one's own body and turning them into part of oneself, they actually had many advantages. The first was their powerful vitality, which made them easy to maintain and cultivate on a large scale. The second was the pure and gentle yang release power contained within them. If used properly, the effects could be outstanding. Because of this, while Kei had previously been conducting human experiments, he had also begun trying to apply them in other directions. Now, a healing medicine created from Hashirama cells had already appeared in preliminary form. After drug testing, the results had been good. Not only was the production cost very low, but it also had many other advantages. Even a severely wounded person on the verge of death could be pulled back with this medicine. If the problem of bodily rejection could be solved to a sufficient degree, then Hashirama cells might even be used in the future to create replacement limbs for crippled shinobi. Just like Obito and Danzo later on. Of course, achieving that would not be easy, and would likely require the development of all kinds of techniques. But Kei did not care about that. After all, he was Konoha's Hokage, and beneath him he had a large group of excellent workhorses who could help with research. For example, Orochimaru, who was still immature at the moment, was a top-tier workhorse in Kei's eyes. As long as he was used properly, he would be able to keep producing results. As time passed, everything proceeded smoothly. In the blink of an eye, the day of the graduation examination arrived. Because of the changes to the Ninja Academy, a great number of shinobi from the major clans had entered this graduation exam, resulting in an unprecedented number of nearly 1,000 participants. Having so many students take the test at once naturally created a mountain of problems. Many people were thrown into frantic confusion because of it. Fortunately, Kei had prepared for this long ago, so in the end, no major disorder broke out. Soon, the results of the examinations came out. The vast majority of students passed, with the success rate reaching a full 90%. These people would then officially obtain the title of genin. No one was surprised by that figure. After all, the requirements for the genin exam were not especially high to begin with. As long as one had mastered the basic clone technique and body flicker technique and possessed a decent taijutsu foundation, that was generally enough to qualify. No matter how untalented a person might be as a shinobi, after enough training, becoming a genin was ultimately not a particularly difficult matter. What truly drew attention was the promotion examination. According to Kei's rules, the number of people who could be promoted into the intermediate academy was limited. Only those ranked within the top 100 would qualify. In other words, the ratio was only 1 in 10. With so many clan shinobi participating, that ratio appeared especially cruel. Many students who had once been considered excellent in the ninja academy were mercilessly eliminated. On the day the results were posted, Kei personally went to the academy to inspect the list. As expected, it's still those two. Looking at the rankings, understanding appeared on Kei's face. The first name on the promotion list was Tsunade. That was no surprise. In this graduation examination, both theory and practical combat carried great weight. Tsunade had studied under Kei for many years, and her grasp of all kinds of theoretical knowledge was incredibly solid, far beyond the others. As for practical combat, there was even less to say. At this current stage, even Orochimaru would not dare claim he could defeat Tsunade. In Kei's view, her taking first place was only natural. Right behind Tsunade was Orochimaru, who had claimed second place. As for the names after third, that was essentially the territory of the major clan students. It was not until the end of the list that Kei saw another familiar name. That guy Jiraiya really is a lifelong dead last. Looking at Jiraiya's name on the list, Kei could not help but smile helplessly. To accommodate people like Jiraiya, who had terrible theory but were exceptionally strong in taijutsu and practical combat, he had deliberately raised the proportion of the practical combat score. He had thought that under those conditions, Jiraiya's results should at least look decent. Unexpectedly, he was still at the bottom. Judging from the situation, he had nearly been eliminated. Still, that was fine. Even though he was at the bottom, he had still made the list in the end. Kei had originally thought that if Jiraiya truly failed the promotion, he might find some way to help him out. After all, he would one day become one of the famous Sannin. He deserved at least that much respect. And even putting aside the title of Sannin, the fact that he would become Namake's Minato's future teacher was already enough to make Kei pay attention to him. After Jiraiya, Kei continued scanning downward, and at the very end of the list, he spotted another somewhat familiar name. If you don't want to wait for the next update, read 50 chapters ahead on patreon.com/fanficlord03, Chapter 101, Chapter 101, The Ideological Clash Between Orochimaru and Hiriko. 1788 words Chapter 101, The Ideological Clash Between Orochimaru and Hiriko. Standing in place, Kei fell into thought. Is this the Hiriko I'm thinking of? If it really was the Hiriko who would go on to create the Chimera technique, then like Orochimaru, he was also a first-rate piece of talent worth training. For Kei, research-oriented talents like this were far more useful than people like Jiraiya, who were only good at fighting. With that thought in mind, his interest was immediately piqued, and he prepared to meet the boy in person. Of course, he did not make it too obvious. He started with Tsunade, the top-ranked student, and worked his way down one by one until the very last. That way, it would not seem suspicious. Otherwise, if he summoned Hiriko alone, it would look far too strange. Besides, as the headmaster, it was only natural for him to encourage the newly admitted students. The individual meetings did not take long. Before long, most of the students ahead had already left, and soon it was Hiriko's turn. Kei quickly met him. Compared to the future, Hiriko looked very young now, roughly the same age as Jiraiya and the others. He had pale skin, white hair, a somewhat nervous expression, and a quiet, introverted personality. Hokage-sama. Hiroko stepped into the office and looked nervously at Kei in front of him. There's no need to be so nervous. Kei smiled, his attitude as gentle as ever. In this promotion exam, your results were the exact opposite of Jiraiya's. His practical combat and taijutsu scores were nearly perfect, but his theory results were close to zero. Your theory score was nearly perfect, but your practical combat and taijutsu were close to zero. In a way, you two are quite similar. He smiled as he spoke. Do you know Jiraiya? Hiroko nodded. You could say we're friends. He was acquainted with Tsunade and the other two. They were all classmates. However, compared to Tsunade and Orochimaru, he was more familiar with Jiraiya. Those two were too much of a genius. No matter how hard Hiroko tried, it was difficult for him to keep up with them, and simply being around them every day put tremendous pressure on him. Jiraiya, on the other hand, was different. At least at the current stage, Hiroko felt that he was not much worse than Jiraiya. Your talent is quite good. It would be a shame not to cultivate it properly. Kei looked at him and spoke calmly. Would you be interested in becoming my assistant? Hearing those words, Hiroko froze, then reacted a moment later. Kei smiled and nodded. Only then did Hiroko fully understand what he had just heard. I'm willing. Very willing. At that moment, an intense surge of joy rose in his heart. For Hiroko, who had always longed to keep up with Tsunade and Jiraiya, being acknowledged by Kei, the Hokage, was of tremendous importance. At the very least, it proved that he truly possessed talent of his own, enough to stand alongside Tsunade and Orochimaru. Besides you, the other selected assistants this time are Tsunade and Orochimaru. As if he could see Hiroko's obsession clearly, Kei continued. I hope the three of you can get along well in the days ahead. If nothing unexpected happens, the three of you will form a small team in the future, and I will lead you personally. As those words fell, Hiroko's heart became even more excited. Only the three of us will become Hokage-sama's assistants. All kinds of thoughts surged through his mind. Tsunade, Orochimaru. I've finally caught up to the two of you. Filled with that thought, he left in visible excitement, leaving Kei alone in the office. The moment he stepped out, Hiroko could not wait to share the good news with his friends. Especially Tsunade and Orochimaru. Is that so? When they heard the news, both Tsunade and Orochimaru were a little surprised. So he chose you, Hiroko. Following the usual tradition of three-person ninja teams, they had already guessed there would likely be one final spot in Kei's assistant team. Before this, they had assumed it would go to someone else, and had even secretly speculated about who it might be. Unexpectedly, that last person turned out to be Hiroko. Why him? When he heard the news, Jiraiya let out a miserable cry. I wanted to team up with Orochimaru and Tsunade too. Selecting assistants for Hokage-sama isn't something done casually. Orochimaru glanced at Jiraiya and shook his head. If this were an ordinary ninja squad, you might still have had a chance. But since he's choosing assistants, you definitely had no hope. As Jiraiya's friend, Orochimaru knew Jiraiya's strengths well. If it had been an ordinary three-person team, then with Jiraiya's outstanding taijutsu and practical combat ability, he might really have been chosen. But Kei's team was different. It would also serve as experimental assistants. From that perspective, Jiraiya had no chance at all. My theory score was perfect. Tsunade's was a little worse, but her level in medical ninjutsu is top class, and she can assist with experiments. Orochimaru continued, if I'm not mistaken, your score on that special exam paper was probably very good too, Hiroko. Otherwise, Hokage-sama wouldn't have noticed you. Hiroko nodded, feeling a trace of pride rise within him. That's right. Tsunade also spoke up. Don't be so discouraged, Jiraiya. After graduating from the intermediate academy, I heard there will be a mentorship system afterward. As long as you pass that exam and get decent scores, you'll be able to choose a mentor and study under them. All of those mentors are outstanding shinobi from the village. As long as you pass that exam, your future won't turn out badly. Compared to the others, Tsunade's relationship with Kei was much closer, so she naturally had a better understanding of his ideas. The so-called mentor training system was essentially the equivalent of a graduate advisor system from Kei's previous life. In Kei's view, such a system was very suitable for Konoha's current situation. Coincidentally, Konoha also had quite a few older shinobi who were now relatively idle. Those veteran shinobi, limited by age and status, could no longer take part in frontline combat as they once had. But their experience and abilities were beyond doubt, making them perfectly suited to become mentors. For example, Uzumaki Mito. Kei planned to invite her to help oversee the academy. With a figure of her stature holding the line, many matters would proceed much more smoothly. Is that true? Then I still have a chance. After hearing Tsunade's words, Jiraiya quickly perked up again. Then all of you better work hard. Don't let me catch up too easily. He burst into a loud, arrogant laugh, already looking forward to life in the intermediate academy. Soon, this group of students who had passed the exam officially began their studies. Because they were the very first batch to go through this new system, the standards had been relatively strict. As a result, the overall quality and ability of these students were very high. To put it bluntly, anyone who could enter the intermediate academy basically had the potential to become a jonin. Outstanding individuals like Jiraiya even had the talent to become Kage in the future. Once they entered the intermediate academy, they would receive the very best resources and instruction. The mentors responsible for teaching the various courses were already in place. They were all specialists invited from the different ninja clans, each with deep experience in their respective techniques, and in many cases, experience instructing members of their own clans. Even the Uzumaki side was no exception. Kei had personally asked Mito to invite several retired senior jonin to help teach sealing techniques. Everything progressed relatively smoothly and gradually settled into place. Once these matters were handled, Kei turned his attention back to his own experiments. He looked toward the laboratory, where a number of results had already begun to take shape. More than a year passed in the blink of an eye. A genius concept. After learning the true identity of the little nine tails by Kei's side, Orochimaru would often stare at it with burning excitement in his eyes. First, use cloning technology to create a body capable of bearing consciousness, then transfer your own consciousness into that body. If this were used properly, wouldn't that directly allow someone to achieve immortality? That thought flashed through his mind, and a wild look of joy appeared on his face. One could even use this method to occupy other people's bodies and forcibly obtain the bloodline limits within them. Brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. Compared to the future, the still young Orochimaru was not yet so extreme. But the obsession with immortality had already taken root inside him. Once the idea surfaced, it immediately began to grow uncontrollably. Immortality is a boring pursuit. Hirako retorted from the side. What's the point of immortality if you have to keep changing bodies? If you really want to pursue something, you should achieve it with your own body. I have an idea. With the technique I'm envisioning, one could take the bloodline limits from others and forcibly fuse them into one's own body. That way, one could continuously gather the bloodline limits of the entire ninja world and converge them all into a single body. Just imagine it. The Senju body and chakra, the Uchiha's Sharingan, the Hyuga's Byakugan, and bloodline limits like dark release and transparent release, all gathered into a single person. What kind of overwhelmingly powerful shinobi would that create? Orochimaru, the immortality you long for is insignificant compared to that kind of power. His face was feverish, as if he could already see that future. Unlike Orochimaru, whose core obsession was immortality, Hirako desired absolute power. Because of that, the direction of his research inside the laboratory was fundamentally different from Orochimaru's. The chimera technique he was developing could forcibly extract bloodline limits from other people's bodies and fuse them into his own. With such a method, even someone born without a bloodline limit could seize the bloodline limits of others by devouring them, forcibly becoming a bloodline limit shinobi and gaining overwhelming power. When he heard Hiriko's words, Orochimaru only sneered. The thoughts of a mediocre talent. Power that is only temporary will always remain temporary. Even someone as powerful as the first Hokage still met his end one day. Only immortality is the truth. If you don't want to wait for the next update, read 50 chapters ahead on patreon.com/fanficlord03, Chapter 102, Chapter 102, Chimera Technique 1772 words. Chapter 102, Chimera Technique. Power is the truth. Eternal life is the truth. Inside the spacious laboratory, Orochimaru and Hiriko stood at odds with each other, neither willing to back down. To some extent, their words represented the divergence in their philosophies. Orochimaru pursued eternity. Power was merely secondary to that pursuit. Because of this, when conducting experiments, he naturally placed greater value on the stability of the results. Stability first, then the pursuit of power. Hiriko, by contrast, was far more radical. Hiriko gave a cold snort. Eternal life without the strength to protect it is nothing but false eternity. A truly powerful person could kill you with a single thought. And with the method you chose, it is not even certain that you can achieve eternal life. He sneered. Continuously seizing other people's bodies might let you reincarnate again and again, but your spirit will inevitably be contaminated. If this keeps going, forget eternal life. You'll probably go mad sooner or later. As long as one's will is strong enough, mere spiritual contamination can be resolved in many ways. Orochimaru was just as blunt. And is your technique really free of risk? Forcibly devouring other people's bloodline limits causes violent rejection within the body. Once or twice may be fine, but if you truly want to do what you described and gather 5, or even more bloodline limits into one body, your body will collapse sooner or later. Even if that kind of power can exist, it will only be temporary. One day, your body will no longer be able to endure it. When that day comes, no method will be able to save you. Hiriko and Orochimaru glared at each other. As people working in the same laboratory, they had long been deeply involved in each other's research. They were more than aware of the flaws in each other's techniques. Generally speaking, both Orochimaru's reincarnation jutsu and Hiriko's chimera technique had major defects. One revolved around seizing bodies with the soul, which meant that the spirit would inevitably suffer repeated erosion. It might not be obvious in the short term, but if it continued long enough, there would eventually come a day when the soul could no longer endure it. True eternity was still far out of reach. Hiriko's chimera technique, on the other hand, centered on devouring bloodline limits. But as Orochimaru had said, blindly devouring more and more bloodline limits would lead to increasingly severe bodily rejection. If things went wrong, it could result in complete bodily collapse. It was also a technique burdened with serious side effects. The flaws in both techniques were obvious. Neither of them had come close to true perfection. You two are disgusting. Not far away, Tsunade listened to their argument, her face full of blatant revulsion. One of you spends every day coveting other people's bodies, and the other spends every day coveting other people's bloodline limits. Do you really have to be this gross? I'm the dignified princess of Konoha. Why do I have to be on a team with you two? Looking at the increasingly unhinged Orochimaru and Hiriko, Tsunade found the situation hard to accept. At the end of the day, she was still a normal person. Though as a shinobi her tolerance was far above that of ordinary people, it was not enough to calmly accept two teammates constantly discussing how to take over other people's bodies and bloodline limits. This is supreme art. What does a vulgar person like you understand, Tsunade? Orochimaru and Hiriko spoke in unison, both glaring at her now. I don't understand anything about art or research. Tsunade clenched her fist. But you two just mentioned the Senju and the Uchiha, didn't you? She wore a smile, but her entire body radiated danger. Standing right in front of you is the granddaughter of the first Hokage, the inheritor of the purest bloodline in the Senju clan. Are the two of you planning to discuss seizing my body or devouring my bloodline limit? And as for the Uchiha's Sharingan, Kei has that too, doesn't he? Don't tell me you were thinking about. We were only giving examples. Just examples. The moment Hirako heard that, he waved his hands frantically and immediately distanced himself from his own words. I would never dare covet teacher's Sharingan. Orochimaru, you were the one just talking about seizing other people's bodies to obtain powerful bloodline limits, weren't you? Seeing Hirako retreat, Tsunade turned her gaze toward Orochimaru. I never said that. Orochimaru waved a hand. Besides, even if I wanted to do something like that, I would naturally choose shinobi from enemy villages. To be honest, the ice release of the Yuki clan and the Shikatsu Miyaku of the Kagaya clan are both quite excellent bloodline limits. At least you know your place. Tsunade let out a snort and said nothing more. What are you all discussing? From behind them, Kei's voice drifted over. The expressions of the three instantly changed. Tsunade's face, which had been full of ferocity just moments ago, immediately softened into exceptional gentleness. Kei, you're here. Orochimaru and the others were just discussing academic topics. She glanced at Orochimaru and Hirako before speaking. Kei immediately became interested. What academic topics? The expressions of Orochimaru and Hirako changed sharply. Sure enough, in the next moment, Tsunade repeated every bit of what the two of them had just been saying. You too. Standing there and listening to Tsunade's retelling, Kei found himself somewhat speechless. It's not a good idea to say things like that so openly in the laboratory. Do you know what would happen if what you just said leaked out? For the major ninja clans, their bloodline limits were things they valued above almost everything else. If talk like that were to spread, it would definitely cause a massive uproar. In that environment, what Hirako and Orochimaru had just said was extremely sensitive. Once it got out, they would probably be immediately branded as people coveting other clans' bloodline limits. By then, their reputations would become utterly dreadful. We understand. Seeing that Kei was not actually angry over what they had said, Orochimaru and Hirako both let out quiet sighs of relief. Neither of them was stupid. Once they calmed down, they both understood that their words had indeed been highly inappropriate. The only reason they had spoken so recklessly was because they had become too heated during the discussion itself. For people like them, that only ever happened during academic debates. Normally, no matter the situation, they were calm people and rarely had such strong emotional reactions. Both the Chimera technique and the reincarnation jutsu have serious flaws. After hearing their reports, Kei gave his conclusion. Once the Chimera technique begins devouring bloodline limits, the body's stability will inevitably decline. The more bloodline limits it devours, the worse that instability becomes. This is an unavoidable drawback. No matter how much the technique is improved, it cannot be completely eliminated. So instead of trying to improve that aspect, it is better to use the technique only once or twice at most. Using the Chimera technique to devour two bloodline limits should already be the body's limit without pushing it into dangerous territory. I would not recommend trying more than that. Hirako, you should begin thinking carefully about which two bloodline limits are truly most suitable for you. He continued, more bloodline limits do not necessarily mean greater strength. Having more does not mean being better. Hashirama-sama, who founded Konoha back then, only possessed would release. The famous Azura of the ninja world, Uchiha Madara, only had the Sharingan. Yet both of them became godlike figures who suppressed the entire shinobi world. Hearing Kei speak like that, Hirako opened his mouth, instinctively wanting to argue, but in the end only nodded. I understand. No, you probably do not. Looking at Hirako's expression, Kei knew very well that Hirako had probably not really taken the words to heart. He was still clinging to his own ideas. But that was only natural. Outstanding researchers were often obsessives. If Hiroko could be made to abandon his beliefs because of a single sentence, then he would never have become such an excellent researcher in the first place. Orochimaru, the same applies to you. After finishing with Hiroko, Kei turned to Orochimaru. Even if your reincarnation jutsu is perfected, you must not use it too frequently. Every reincarnation will cause you to be influenced by the original owner of the body. If you undergo too many reincarnations, whether you are still yourself in the end, or have become someone else carrying your memories, will become a major question. I understand. Orochimaru froze for a moment, then nodded solemnly, clearly taking Kei's warning to heart. After finishing his exchange with the two of them, Kei continued. The testing phase of the Chimera technique is complete. It is about time for a real trial. Let me do it. At the mention of that, Hiroko immediately became eager. Teacher, I'm ready. The Chimera technique was a forbidden jutsu that had been gradually perfected over the past 2 years, and at present, only the 4 of them knew about it. Since Kei now intended to perform a real test, one of the 4 naturally had to be chosen as the subject. And Hiroko felt that he was the most suitable candidate. After all, the Chimera technique had originally been his idea, and the majority of the detailed research had also been completed by him. To put it bluntly, he was the one who understood this technique best. And in terms of strength, he was the weakest among the 3, including Orochimaru, and also the one who most urgently needed to perform the Chimera technique. Looking at Hiroko, Kei thought for a moment, then agreed. He did indeed need someone to carry out a true attempt with the Chimera technique. Only by witnessing the entire process personally could he make more accurate observations, and then improve and refine it further afterward. From that perspective, Hiroko really was a suitable candidate. As for the bloodline limit that needed to be devoured, Kei had already chosen it for him. Would release. The performance of the Chimera technique did not require a living person. It only required flesh and blood with enough vitality to serve as material. And in that regard, the would-release bloodline of the first Hokage was undoubtedly the most convenient choice. If you don't want to wait for the next update, read 50 chapters ahead on patreon.com/fanficlord03, Chapter 103, Chapter 103, Drawbacks 1232 words Chapter 103, Drawbacks. As material for the Chimera technique, the first Hokage's cells possessed many advantages. First of all, they were powerful enough. Among the many Kekkei Genkai that existed in the shinobi world, would-release was undoubtedly one of the highest tier types. Even the Uchiha clan's Sharingan and the Hyuga clan's Byakugan could not surpass would-release. At most, they stood on the same level. Beyond being powerful enough, the first Hokage's mastery over would-release had also reached an astonishing level. If the Chimera technique was to devour a Kekkei Genkai, it naturally could not be done using just any random target. After all, even within the same Kekkei Genkai, the degree of awakening could vary greatly. Just as within the Uchiha clan, some people might never awaken the Sharingan in their entire lives, while others could go so far as to awaken the Mangekyo Sharingan. There was a major drawback to devouring Kekkei Genkai through the Chimera technique. Because a Kekkei Genkai devoured through the Chimera technique was not truly one's own, it was far harder to improve than an innate one. Therefore, if one wanted to maximize the effect of a Kekkei Genkai, the best option was to devour one that had already been developed to an extremely high degree. In that regard, the first Hokage's would-release held an overwhelming advantage. After all, in Hashirama's body, would-release had already been pushed to its absolute peak. It was naturally the most suitable Kekkei Genkai to devour. Best of all, despite all these advantages, the first Hokage's cells also had the traits of being low-cost and easy to replicate. This was essentially the most suitable material for the Chimera technique. That night, Hiroko did not sleep at all. He remained in a state of excitement the entire time. It was not until the next morning that he got up and headed straight for the laboratory, ready to wait for the next stage. Passing through the facility, he went through one procedure after another. Only after confirming that his body showed no problems did he formally begin the process. Finally, he entered the specially prepared environment inside the laboratory and lay down directly within it. All data is normal. Hashirama-sama's cells have also been temporarily suppressed. Inside the laboratory, personnel moved back and forth, all of their attention fixed on the data. Kei stood before the operating table, looking at Hiroko as he spoke softly. "How do you feel right now?" Hiroko replied, "I'm already getting impatient." He looked like a child waiting for a brand new toy, his entire face filled with excitement and anticipation. Perhaps to him, this was a rare chance to change his fate. Kei understood his feelings, so he could not be bothered to offer any more advice. After all, advice would be useless. There was no point wasting the effort. "Get ready, and remember to keep your consciousness clear." He still repeated the precautions with patient thoroughness, reminding Hiroko not to lose consciousness. When performing the Chimera technique, one's consciousness had to remain clear. Otherwise, accidents could easily occur. More importantly, Hiroko himself needed to describe his sensations in real time, so that everyone present could understand what was happening and take corresponding measures. Soon, the experiment began. Concentrated first Hokage cells were injected into Hiroko's body. Only a moment later, Hiroko let out a miserable scream. Hashirama-sama's cells are invading his body. A shinobi from the Hyuga clan assisting nearby spoke loudly. "The speed has exceeded the standard rate. Activate the backup plan." Kei did not hesitate in the slightest and made the decision immediately. The greatest difficulty in devouring the first Hokage's cells lay in their terrifying invasiveness. If left unchecked, that horrifying devouring and infective nature was enough to turn a human body into a piece of wood in an instant. Fortunately, Kei and the others had long prepared for this. The experiment lasted a full half-day before the situation finally stabilized. Hiroko's body gradually calmed down, and a faint pale color began to appear on the surface of his skin. The chakra contained within Hashirama's cells slowly started to merge with his own chakra, gradually becoming one. As expected, it still cannot be inherited completely. Sensing the condition inside Hiroko's body, Kei could not help but feel a trace of disappointment. Just as he had expected, even using the Chimera technique to devour the first Hokage's cells and obtain would release in this way still produced an incomplete result. Judging from the current situation, Hiroko would likely only reach the level of Yamato in the future, far from the terrifying might of the first Hokage himself. Even just Yamato's level is already pretty good. Kei pondered silently. Yamato's later performance might not have seemed especially remarkable, but that was only because he was being compared to Senju Hashirama. In truth, Yamato's strength was not inferior to Kakashi before he awakened the Mangekyo Sharingan. At the very least, he stood at the level of a Kage class threshold. With Hiroko's original physique, undergoing this transformation ritual meant he would immediately be reborn. Moreover, this was only the first devouring. A second one could still be performed in the future. Kei felt that if would release could later be paired with a set of Sharingan, then the combination of Yin release and Yang release would certainly have a very promising future. A string of miserable screams rang out ahead. The data on the instruments in front of him fluctuated wildly, then quickly settled back into stability. That signified Hiroko's final success. It actually worked. To the side, many of those present stared ahead with feverish expressions, as if they had just witnessed a miracle. In the past, Kekkai Genkai had always been innate. If an ordinary shinobi did not have one, then they simply did not. But from this day onward, everything had changed. Through the Chimera technique, it was now entirely possible to plunder another shinobi's Kekkai Genkai, creating the effect of mass-producing Kekkai Genkai-wielding shinobi. This technique must never be allowed to spread recklessly. Uchiha Kagami had watched the entire process, and his expression was grave. Otherwise, Konoha will likely descend into chaos. He was a wise man, and the moment he saw the result, he immediately foresaw the consequences of the Chimera technique becoming widespread. Once this technique spread, it would inevitably lead to everyone in Konoha trying to imitate it. If that happened, the harmony Konoha currently enjoyed would vanish completely. Shinobi with Kekkai Genkai would become prey to be fought over, and trust between shinobi would disappear, replaced by mutual suspicion and hostility. Especially the clans that possessed powerful Kekkai Genkai would likely become the targets of everyone's greed. The Uchiha clan's Sharingan and the Hyuga clan's Byakugan were the clearest examples. Those were bloodlines coveted by nearly everyone. If this technique spread, then every shinobi in Konoha would likely begin watching the Uchiha and Hyuga with greedy eyes. I understand. Kei nodded. This technique will be classified as a forbidden jutsu. In the future, no one will be permitted to use it without the Hokage's approval. Kagami finally relaxed a little after hearing that. If you don't want to wait for the next update, read 50 chapters ahead on patreon.com/fanficlord03, Chapter 104, Chapter 104, The Clouds of War 1245 words Chapter 104, The Clouds of War. In practical terms, the Chimera technique was an extremely powerful jutsu. As long as it was used properly, even an ordinary shinobi could make a sudden leap and become a powerful Kekkai Genkai user. However, from another perspective, this technique could just as easily destabilize everything and lead to all kinds of problems. Furthermore, Kei himself was not optimistic about the long-term future of a Kekkai Genkai obtained through devouring. Using another person's body to mutate one's own body was never a truly clean process. No one could say for certain how many years of life would remain after gaining a Kekkai Genkai in such a way. So no matter how useful it was, Kei had already decided that this technique would be sealed away. Aside from a very small number of people, no one would ever be given the chance to touch it. Of course, that would be after he had used it himself. Inside the quiet laboratory, Kei walked out alone. He made his way to the deepest section of the lab, lay down on the operating table, and formed a hand seal. Shadow Clone Technique. With the jutsu activated, 2 identical keys appeared on the spot. Even though performing surgery on myself feels a little strange, for the sake of secrecy, this is the only way. Looking at the clone in front of him, Kei spoke softly. The procedure needs to be completed before the shadow clone technique runs out. It should be fine. The clone replied, the chakra you split off is enough. It should last quite a while. Try to be as fast as possible. The other clone added, once the operation is complete and everything returns to normal, no one will notice a thing. Kei nodded, then lay down without hesitation. After that, another long process began. When the experiment finally ended, Kei quickly sat up. This feeling. He raised one hand. The fair arm before his eyes looked almost like an infant's, smooth and lustrous, carrying a crystalline sheen. Across that arm, pale Hashirama cells spread visibly over his skin. Yet unlike Hiriko's earlier situation, Kei's state was clearly very different. He could feel those terrifying Hashirama cells reviving inside his body, but at the same time, they were being suppressed by another power, unable to display the rampant activity and erosion they should have had. That power was none other than Kagaya's seal power. As expected, it works. With a single thought from Kei, markings began to appear across his face, spreading densely over most of it and lending him an eerie, almost otherworldly beauty. Seal release. The moment Kagaya's seal power was fully released, the Hashirama cells inside his body were rapidly subdued, then absorbed and fused into him. That result directly proved Kei's previous hypothesis. Kagaya's seal power really could unify and absorb these bloodline powers. Even cells as overbearing as the first Hokage's, once they encountered the seal power within Kei's body, were like a grandson meeting his grandfather. Well, in a certain sense, that comparison was not inaccurate. Kei found the whole process almost absurdly smooth. He had encountered virtually no obstacles, and had absorbed the first Hokage's cells into his own body with ease. Then, in the very next instant, changes began to appear. The chakra within him started to expand rapidly. What had already been a massive reserve nearly tripled or quadrupled in the blink of an eye. The boost the first Hokage's cells gave a shinobi was simply too great. Most importantly, Kei had also obtained wood release. Though weaker than the original, it was still far stronger than what Hiriko had acquired earlier. Kagaya's seal power and wood release were astonishingly compatible. Just by obtaining the wood release bloodline, Kei could already feel the progress of his bloodline puzzle increasing dramatically, almost doubling compared to before. The effect is excellent. A smile appeared on his face. He was clearly in a good mood. Then next, the Kinkaku brothers. His thoughts quickly shifted to them. Those two were also direct descendants of the Sage of Six Paths, and possessed powerful Otsutsuki bloodlines. If he devoured them as well, then in theory, it should strengthen his bloodline puzzle even further. However, after considering it for a moment, Kei still gave up on the idea for now. One had to eat one bite at a time to digest it properly. He had only just finished integrating wood release. His body still needed time to fully adapt. If he immediately used the Chimera technique again, he might not be able to bear it. To be safe, it was better to wait. Stepping out of the laboratory, Kei felt the fresh air outside brush against him. For him now, the enormous increase in chakra within his body was not a small enhancement. It had raised his combat power by an entirely different level. And if the suppressive effect would release had untailed beast chakra was also taken into account, then if he were to face the Kinkaku brothers again now, the battle would no longer be nearly as troublesome as before. Of course, the most important thing was still would release itself. Now that the experiment was complete, Kei was prepared to settle down and remain quiet for a while. Meanwhile, out in Konoha, changes were happening with each passing day. 2 years had passed, and under Kei's influence, the entire village had undergone enormous transformation. All across Konoha, the old disorderly buildings had gradually disappeared, replaced by new structures arranged in neat, orderly rows that gave the village a sense of unified beauty. Streetlights stood along the roads. At a glance, it almost felt as though one had stepped through time into a completely new era. The village has become even more prosperous. Standing at the edge of Konoha and looking at the scene within, Danzo and the others, who had just returned from a mission outside the village, could not help but sigh. It really does look nice. Only after spending time outside could one truly appreciate the scale of the changes Konoha had undergone. One had to remember that in many parts of the Land of Fire, there were still people who could not even afford rice balls. Yet inside Konoha, every household already had electricity, and every person could eat their fill and live without worrying about their next meal. Of course, that situation was still limited to Konoha itself. In many areas outside Konoha, life was still far from ideal. Because of Konoha's prosperity, many upper-class individuals from all across the shinobi world had begun choosing to settle in Konoha, not hesitating to spend huge sums of money to purchase land and houses there. For a time, property prices throughout the village had climbed sharply. Anyone who had originally owned a home there had now effectively become wealthy, earning substantial income simply by renting out property. As for industry, there was even less to say. His ability to develop the village is truly impeccable. Danzo looked at the prosperous sight before him, and let out a sigh. My loss to him back then was not unjustified after all. But if we want to protect the prosperity here, we will have to continue working harder. His gaze gradually deepened. War is coming. If you don't want to wait for the next update, read 50 chapters ahead on p@trian.com/fanficlord03, Chapter 105, Chapter 105, Arrangements 1294 words. Chapter 105, Arrangements, can it be confirmed? Inside the Hokage's office, Kei looked at Danzo, the faint smile on his face already gone. So Kumogakure has really made its move. In all likelihood, yes. Danzo nodded. My men have already investigated Kumogakure's movements. Large numbers of Kumogakure shinobi are mobilizing, and they are heading toward the land of whirlpools. When did this news arrive? Kei followed up at once. Roughly 10 days ago. Then I'm afraid it may already be too late. Kei shook his head. If 10 days have already passed, then barring any accidents, Kumogakure has likely finished its preparations and is ready to act. Then what should we do? Danzo asked, should we declare war on Kumogakure? That would be a bit excessive. Kei spoke calmly. Either way, let's gather everyone first and discuss it. He sent someone to notify the others. A moment later, Kagami and the rest hurried over. Kagami, Homura, and Danzo, who was already present, essentially formed Konoha's current high command. Over the past 2 years, it was precisely because these people had worked alongside him, and carried much of the burden that Konoha had been able to develop into what it was today. As soon as Kagami and the others entered the Hokage's office, they were briefly surprised to see Danzo there. But the moment they noticed Kei's serious expression, they immediately realized something had happened. What happened? Koharu was the first to ask. Kumogakure has moved. Kei did not waste words. Danzo's men detected troop movements from Kumogakure heading toward the coast of the Land of Fire. With such a large-scale mobilization, they are either preparing for war against the Land of Fire or moving against the Land of Whirlpools. It is most likely the Land of Whirlpools. Danzo added, if they were preparing to attack the Land of Fire, they would not be taking this route. So they are finally making their move. Hearing this, everyone present frowned. In truth, none of them were particularly surprised. They had been mentally prepared for this ever since Kei warned them 2 years ago. What truly caught them off guard was how soon it was happening. Only 2 years had passed since the rebellion of the Kinkaku brothers, and Kumogakure was already this impatient to make another move. No matter what, the Land of Whirlpools must be saved. Kei spoke directly, setting the tone at once. Koharu, how many people do we currently have stationed at the base near the Land of Whirlpools? A total of 1,000. Koharu answered immediately. Following your earlier orders, Hokage-sama, they are all well-trained Chunin. If we exclude those who must remain behind on guard, the force we can mobilize is around 800. 800. Kei nodded slightly. That should be enough. Because of the distance and the lack of time, even if he decided to support the Land of Whirlpools, it was impossible to bring too many troops with him. But the size of an army was always relative. The number Konoha had stationed near the Land of Whirlpools was not large, yet Kumogakure was launching a long-distance raid. They likewise could not deploy too many troops there without difficulty. As long as those 800 men were used properly, they would be enough to buy Konoha a great deal of time. If they could just hold on until Konoha's main force arrived, then everything would still be salvageable. The commander at that base is Kawaki, correct? Kei turned to Kagami. And Setsuna and the others are there as well. Kagami nodded. That was your personal arrangement, Hokage-sama. Stationing Kawaki near the Land of Whirlpools had been a decision made entirely on the basis of strength. After all, that base existed specifically to guard against a surprise attack from Kumogakure. If the commander there were too weak, then the entire arrangement would lose much of its value. Relatively speaking, Kawaki's strength was quite solid. As the former head of the Uchiha clan, he possessed top-tier Sharingan, and when that was combined with his own ninjutsu and genjutsu, his strength was enough to step into the threshold of Kage level. With someone like him in command, supported by elite Uchiha Jonin like Setsuna, they should be able to stall any Kage-level opponent for a long time unless they happen to face the third Raikage himself. Pass my orders to Kawaki. Kei spoke without hesitation. Tell him to act according to the situation and pay close attention to all intelligence from the Land of Whirlpools. Once Kumogakure truly makes its move, he is to stall them for as long as possible. No matter what, Kumogakure must be pinned down in the Land of Whirlpools for at least 3 days. After that, Konoha's reinforcements will arrive, and the situation will improve. Kagami's expression grew solemn. What if they really cannot hold them back? Then they buy time for the Uzumaki clan to evacuate. Danzo answered coldly. Even the Uzumaki clan's bloodline and sealing techniques, I would rather see them destroyed than fall into Kumogakure's hands. If it comes to that, then they will become Konoha's sinners. The words were cold enough that several people present frowned the moment they heard them. Kagami turned to look at Kei, clearly waiting for his real decision. It will be fine. Kei's expression remained calm. Tell Kawaki and the others to do their utmost. If it truly becomes impossible, then I will personally head to the battlefield. Kawaki and the others only need to hold the line for as long as they can. He did not think it was an impossible task. The land of whirlpools was isolated overseas, and the nation itself was protected by the Uzumaki clan's barriers. Under those circumstances, with the addition of the Uchiha elites led by Kawaki, stalling for 3 days should not be too difficult. Of course, Kei had never liked forcing others to do the impossible, nor did he enjoy pinning his hopes entirely on others. If Kawaki and the others truly could not do it, then he would simply go himself. The Flying Thunder God Kunai had already been prepared. If it truly came to that, he could use the Flying Thunder God technique to arrive at the land of whirlpools at any time. When that time came, there would naturally be other ways to deal with the situation. At that thought, something stirred in his heart. The experiments involving the 9 tails should be ready for their first real trial by now. During these past 2 years, aside from the Chimera technique and the Reincarnation jutsu, he had never relaxed his research into the power of the 9 tails chakra. And judging from the current progress, that research was just about ready for the first proper test. After leaving the office, he returned straight to the laboratory and walked deep into its innermost section. There a 9-tailed fox lay quietly on the ground. It looked as though it were training, lying prone with an oddly harmonious aura about it. With each breath, strands of invisible natural energy were drawn into its body, fusing with its own power and amplifying it. You're here. Before Kei even fully approached, the 9 tails had already sensed him and opened its eyes. As the natural energy continued to flow into its body, much of the hostility that once surrounded it seemed to have faded. Its entire presence now carried a different feeling altogether. Compared to how it had been 2 years ago, the 9 tails condition was clearly much better now. If you don't want to wait for the next update, read 50 chapters ahead on p@trian.com/fanficlord03. Don't forget to like and subscribe to Novels Wonderland.